Okay, 6:03, might as well get going. I have to say it's getting a little bit old. I hope that we would move to once a month, just discuss, economy, social issues, who knows what. That hope doesn't seem to be coming true in any which way. Um, it's hard to express the frustration that I feel and almost everybody I know feels. Uh, this is something that's never happened before, of course, in Israel's history. But this endless war, at this second, is not quite a war because things are relatively quiet, other than a Houthi missile today. But it's not quiet because we know we have hostages still being held, and we know we're going back to war, to a more active war starting soon. It's an impossible situation. It's an impossible situation for our economy. It's an impossible situation for people. I don't know how to really fully express it, but people are just depressed, feeling that they can't do anything about it. There's so many different ways I can describe it, and yet on some levels tuned out. It's very hard to come up with the right combination. Today was the day of national protest, rage, whatever it might be, whatever you want to call it. Um, the fact of the matter is, um, whether it's successful or not successful, it's very hard to know how you define it. It didn't bring the country to a stop. On the other hand, at least what was being discussed all day long on TV and everywhere else was the issue of the hostages. So it brought it to the forefront. Not that it's ever really far from anyone's minds, at least the minds of most of the country. I don't want to talk about people who seem to be blindly supporting Netanyahu or Ben Gvir. The day got off to a jarring start in the sense, not the day got off and the first thing in the morning, like every morning I was in Hostage Square, and by usually it's empty, just maybe another dog owner passing by. But today already at a little after 7, there were already groups of people who were already there. But at 8 o'clock, there's a news show I listen to every day, and the first person to be interviewed was Minister of National Security Ben Gvir. And the first thing he said, and it's like, it's not, I guess from him you should expect it. But instead of saying on this day of um, national identification with the hostages, I may not agree with everything people are doing, but I want them well, and I think it's important. Instead, the first thing he said before being even asked a question, the demonstrations are a total failure. They've failed. The Kaplanistim is what they call the people who are demonstrating against the judicial reform. That's become a shorthand amongst Bibi supporters for the terrible people on the left who, quote unquote, caused October 7th. And not Bibi or anything else, but the Kaplanistim. But anyway, the Kaplanistim have failed again, basically, is what he said. It just shows this total lack of empathy. It's really hard to even believe that these people could have such little empathy. It really is. Um, and they do. And I've written about it before, and it's really something it just doesn't make any sense, but it does. It's like even the worst Republican um, members of Congress manage in their districts or whatever else to show a little bit of empathy for people who have problems, etc. Maybe not the um, illegal immigrant, but generally speaking, they show some empathy for everybody. They know they represent everybody to some extent. These people just don't show it at all, and a lack of empathy towards the families and how they've turned this into a political fight. It's so bizarre almost. Yes, a higher percentage of those people who were kidnapped on October 7th came from quote unquote left-wing kibbutzim, because guess who was on the border with Gaza? Kibbutzim. And who were on the kibbutzim? Generally, they were left-wing kibbutzim. There is a religious kibbutz one step behind, in other words, not on the Gaza border, but I don't know, maybe a kilometer and a half from the border, kibbutz Sa'ad. There are some religious moshavim in the area, but the confrontation kibbutzim directly on the border, the confrontation villages, whatever you want to call them, right on the border, were all kibbutzim. So yes, a significant portion of the people um, who were kidnapped were kibbutznikim. And generally speaking, today it's not the same as it once was. Generally speaking, they were more left than not. There also, a lot of people kidnapped were from the Nova Music Festival. Well, they clearly weren't religious if they were at the Nova Music Festival on Simchat Torah Shabbat, so they don't count. Although in reality, there are a bunch of kids who have come from religious families who had left the religious fold, at least temporarily, and were at the music festival. But in any case, somewhere along the line, they managed to turn this into a left-right fight, which is absurd because the fight, always a sense in the Israeli ethos that we don't leave anyone behind, that's part of who this country is we're all in it for everybody. And despite whatever differences we might have, et cetera, we're all in it together. And of course, part of the people who have been captured, although it's a small part, the ones that are left, were soldiers who were there doing their duty on October 7th. So it's this absurd situation that's been created where, um, the protesters today were attacked repeatedly by almost every minister of the government. Netanyahu today said at the cabinet meeting that those protesters who are trying to end the war, they want to guarantee that another October 7th occurs again. Now, we could argue, I could argue with people about, is the best way to end this war right now to give in to Hamas's demands and pull out unilaterally in order to get back the hostages? Is the best thing to do right now to agree to Hamas remaining in power in Gaza in some form or another just to get our hostages back? That's a reasonable argument to be made. I clearly think getting the hostages back is a much higher priority because I don't think Hamas is much of a danger right now. But to keep on bringing up October 7th, if Prime Minister Netanyahu, the person who's single-handedly the most responsible for October 7th, he's the one who approved the money to Hamas every year, and he's the one who ignored the warnings of the intelligence community. The army is very responsible, but he was the prime minister for most of the last 20 years. Single most important person who's most responsible, and for him to make the statement that we can't end the war now because we'll have another October 7th. It's the most absurd statement coming from him, of course, but generally coming. We are not, and it's used again and again, we can't have another October 7th. Well, guess what? We are not going to have October 7th in the same way we didn't have another Yom Kippur War. October 7th was very different than the Yom Kippur War. Yes, those were two cases 50 years apart when the Israeli intelligence was caught with its pants down, so to speak, and the country paid a terrible price for that. Much more so on October 7th because during the Yom Kippur War, we had warning for a few hours, and the troops had some warning, and wasn't a long enough warning, and we made certain political decisions not to preempt an attack. That's a whole other historic question that we could look at. But here we didn't have that choice. Here, if we would have known they were coming 5 hours before, 10 hours before, it would never have happened. But okay, that's a different story altogether, and we can discuss that for writing in the history books. But it will never happen again. We will never leave a border with potential attack unguarded again, like we did on October 7th. We will never assume we have the answers in terms of intelligence and we'll have the warnings. That doesn't mean Israel won't be surprised again. Doesn't mean there won't be additional tragedies in our future. Hopefully it won't be for another 50 years. But we will not get another October 7th from Gaza, whether Hamas remains in power now or it doesn't. The idea that somehow Hamas is going to disappear, of course, because we're going to just fight them to the end is an absurdity. I've written this and I believe this very strongly. As long as they're Palestinians who hate us, there's going to be some version of a Hamas. And exactly with Hamas's name, I don't know. But there'll be some version. There'll be some version of people who believe the only way to gain what they think are their rights is through armed struggle. Will they be a majority? Will they be a minority? Well, that's a lot of questions that we don't have answers to. And I won't even be willing to guess those answers. And I would not be willing to risk our future based on those answers. I'm not someone who believes we have to take a risk for peace in the sense that we have to believe that, they're ready to live in peace and therefore we have to do X, Y, and Z. Whatever we do down the road, we have to assume they hate us. And we have to assume that if they can, they'll try to wipe us out. That doesn't mean we can occupy them forever. It doesn't, because it's not good for us. We can't afford to. The numbers are staggering what it costs us. Just this last 2.5 month operation in Gaza that failed, basically. It didn't get us close to a deal. It didn't bring down Hamas. That alone cost us 15 billion shekels, which is about $4 billion. That's on top of our regular defense budget, just that additional attack. If we go forward with the attack on Gaza City, that will probably, based on estimates, cost at least twice that. And so you're talking about something in the area of 30 billion, maybe 35 billion, $10 billion. That's on top of all the increases in the defense budget we're already planning. Who's going to pay for that? Where is that going to continue to come from? And of course, we can't decide whether to have war or peace based on finances, but it's a factor. It's something you can't ignore. That war with Iran, however successful, was incredibly expensive. People don't like talking about it, but every interceptor we sent up was probably somewhere around between $5 and $6 million a piece. I don't know how many we used, but it was quite a large number. They're having to be rebuilt now. I mean, the new ones are being built now. The next generation is being worked on, and the generation after that. All these things are very, very expensive. And yes, we're a relatively wealthy country. Yes, Israeli companies get sold for billions, but the pit is not endless. And the fact of the matter is, um, it's way too expensive. Now, it doesn't, I'm not even talking about the human costs. I'm not talking about the number of reserve days that these average Israeli reservists, combat reservists, had to do. Those themselves have been very difficult, both financially for the people doing it, difficult for their families. Marriages have broken up. You do 250 days of reserve duty in a year. That doesn't leave a lot of time to be home. It doesn't leave a lot of time for your business. If you work for the government, you're probably okay. But if you work in private business, they're not really thrilled to lose you for that many days. They can't really fire you, but they can make sure you don't get the next advance you're expecting and the bonus and everything else. And if you have your own business, forget it. Forget it. Just doesn't, I remember doing reserve duty when I had my own business. No one could pay me for the time I lost. It just doesn't happen. So here we are. It's a day where the people of the country are crying out to the government, make a deal, make a deal to bring the war to an end. And the government is not interested in bringing the war to an end. The reports are that Hamas now is willing to make a partial deal. Now, generally speaking, I thought a partial deal was a bad idea. But the moment Hamas said they're willing to do a partial deal, now the government is saying, no, no partial deals. We only want a whole deal. But we only want a whole deal on our terms, and our terms are basically disarming of Hamas, removal from power, some other force in Gaza, this other force, we don't even know who they are because this government won't talk about that, because most of the Arab world who's willing to participate is only willing to participate if they get the cover of the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority is considered a terrible thing because the Palestinian Authority wants something in West Bank and Yehuda v'Shamron. And of course, this government believes that all of that area should be ours. And I'm not really sure where they think the Palestinians are going, but we'll leave that part aside. So that's where we stand at the moment. We're talking about sometime, talking about after the holidays. It's not at all clear that they'll begin the assault on Gaza City. They'll start trying to move the people in Gaza into new humanitarian zones that are going to be set up. I don't know how easy it's going to be to move 1 million people again. I don't know how good a job we're going to do on setting up these new humanitarian areas. These things are not easy. I just did a podcast interview, which I'll probably publish on Tuesday morning our time, with a university researcher who researched humanitarian aid missions all over the world and tried to learn from other places, Somali, Iraq, Sudan, other places on, do they work? And his bottom line was in almost no places do they really work well. In almost all cases, do on all cases do the people in charge, the warlords or Hamas in this case, they take 80%, 90% for their own usage and make money off of it. Um, that's what they do on a regular basis. Um, and it never really works. On the other hand, in discussing it with him, the answer was, well, is there any choice? And there really isn't. The only choice is to send our men to disperse it, which comes down to the fact that we have to disperse the food ourselves if we don't want it to go to Hamas. But we're not willing to do that for obvious reasons. So it's a real conundrum because if we have control of most of Gaza, we're responsible for the people of Gaza. We're responsible for their food, of their medical care, of everything. And so we really can't have it both ways, although we'd like to have it both ways. And so that's really the challenge when it comes to that. Someone mentioned, just pushed in the chat, that wanted to know my comment on Ezra Klein's podcast on the fact that genocide being committed in Gaza, and he had Richard Fiore, I guess it was, being interviewed. I'd be quite honest, I did not listen to it. I couldn't take that after the week before or a couple of days before he had the the Palestinian activists from Colombia. And he decided that those were the two most important subjects that Americans want to hear about right now, one after the other. I don't mind him coming to the subject every once in a while, but it's a little bit strange that he decided he had to come to this one week after the other. It was less than a week between them. But to the actual issue, there are probably ministers in our government that would not be opposed to what people would define as genocide. But the government's policy is clearly not genocide. The government's policy um, is trying to separate out a population that supports a guerrilla movement from the guerrilla movement and trying to pressure them to give up. And along the way, people die. And that's terrible. But that's a fact. It's a terrible fact that civilians die in conflict. Do I think less civilians should be dying in Gaza? Probably. If I was the person running the campaign, even from the very beginning, I might have been able to push for a little bit um, lighter touch, or maybe not. If I was the parent of a soldier who's going in, would I want a lighter touch? Probably not. And so it's a very difficult line. And again, my whole problem with this line about the genocide is that there are two sides in this conflict, and one side could give up tomorrow morning. And if they gave up tomorrow morning, no more civilians would die in Gaza. It's really as simple as that. They insist on fighting from within their population, endangering their population, and fighting to the last Gazan. They like the fact when Gazans get killed because it makes great TV. TV for them, obviously. So while I think there's much to be criticized about some of the things we've done in Gaza, and I think, our feet were a little bit heavy on the gas sometimes. On the other hand, um, there is this other group, they're terrorists that came in, beheaded people, raped people, did all these other things, and now they hid amongst the civilian population, and therefore civilians die. And like I said, it's terrible, but it's not genocide. It's not genocide. And I'm even sure that somewhere along the line, there's some things we did that would probably be defined as war crimes. But then I'll guarantee you that if you look back at what, the United States did in Iraq or in Afghanistan, there were plenty of cases of war crimes. And if we go all the way back to Vietnam, when there weren't the rules that exist today, you'll find lots and lots of war crimes. And I'm not just talking about My Lai Village, which was the most well-known case of a war crime during the Vietnam War, of those of you, few of you who are old enough to even know what I'm talking about. So, and that was something that was done intentional. Those people were killed intentionally. Um, so yes, um, war is terrible. This war is particularly terrible. This war should have ended a year and a half ago, a year ago, certainly last May, May of 2024. There was no reason we couldn't have made a deal and end the war. But we didn't. Netanyahu didn't want for political reasons, and so we didn't end the war in May of 23, 24, excuse me. But here we are, and it continues, and it's terrible. But again, it's not all on us. And that's what needs to be made clear again and again and again. The fact that, you know, all the discussion is Israel needs to do X, Y, and Z. And you know what? I, as an Israeli, can say that my government should do X, Y, and Z. But outside the country, have you seen one demonstration anywhere in the world, maybe among some Jews, but anywhere in the world that's calling on Hamas to stop fighting? Have you seen that anywheres? Once? Have you seen any people who want peace calling on Hamas to give up their arms and agree to end the war? Have you seen that once anywheres? That says an awful lot. That says where we are to a very large extent. It doesn't exempt us. It doesn't whitewash what we've done or not done or how careful we have or have not been. But it puts it into perspective, and we need to keep that perspective because there are two sides. It doesn't mean that Hamas and the Palestinians don't have some power in this, don't have some agency in what happens. That's relating to the war. Talk about briefly about a related topic, which is the drafting of the ultra-Orthodox. As you know, in order to try to keep the ultra-Orthodox happy, Netanyahu ousted the head of the Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee, who was committed to passing a law that would end up in drafting some significant number of ultra-Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox don't want to be drafted. Let's make it very clear. So he picked to head the committee one of his henchmen. There's no other way of calling Bismuth, someone who's very close to him, someone who has no defense experience whatsoever. And this is a committee that doesn't only deal with the draft, it deals with some of the biggest secrets Israel has. It's the only committee that it has some sort of responsibility for overseeing the army, and its subcommittee oversees the intelligence services as well. So he put someone with no experience, no background to head the committee to try to pass a law that would exempt the ultra-Orthodox to a large extent from service. Obviously, that doesn't go down very well with most of the rest of the country, especially the reservists. I don't think he'll be able to pass the law. I don't think he has a majority of people in Likud who will pass a law that Yuli Edelstein, the person who was thrown off his head, opposes. He's going to try. To him, keeping his generational deal with the ultra-Orthodox community is something that he does not want to give up easily. And so he will do all he can to maintain that relationship. And the single most important thing to them is keeping their youth out of the army. One of the heads, Moshe Gafni, who has been the head of the finance committee, I'll get to that in 2 seconds. The finance committee, until he was left the government, because the ultra-Orthodox theoretically left the government, said the other day, it's like the Romans attacking us. The Romans, that's what it's just like when they're trying to get us to go into the draft. It's just like the Romans attacking us. And we've heard other similar statements. It's just hard to believe. But it's even hard to believe. Look, Gafni was replaced by a guy who has been accused of rape. And that didn't stop the Likud from electing him to head the finance committee, which is the second most powerful committee, and can basically move money from one part of the budget to the other part of the budget with almost no one controlling it. So this person who comes out of I'll just define it as a small, close-knit community all over that's into Kabbalah, and exists across borders and has a rabbi heading it. He's a member of that community. I won't describe it anymore because people have been sued for describing it anymore. But what I can absolutely say is the man has been accused of, he hasn't been convicted, but he's been accused of rape, but that didn't stop the Likud from making him head of this most powerful committee. So it's just another black mark on a government that all it has is full of black marks at this point, but might, according to polls, might not win the next election, but might get enough support that no one else will be able to form a government in the next election. Um, so, um, so that's where we stand. Someone who made a comment here that Gaza's population is increasing. We have no idea whether Gaza's population is increasing. The story that its population was increasing was based on something that the State Department put out a year ago, and was based more on projections than in reality. I doubt its population is increasing. There have been a significant number of people leaving Gaza and living in Egypt, somewhere 60, 70,000. And if you assume 40,000 are dead, it's hard to believe that the natural birth rate, which remains really high, um, is increasing. I mean, the fact that people are bringing kids into this world in Gaza under these circumstances um, is hard for me to understand. But okay, that's maybe just don't know what birth control is. I don't use it in any which way. But okay, it's a different story altogether. Okay, any rate. Yeah, okay. So the question about whether how Israel can get better politicians, I don't know. Um, Not all of them are flawed. A lot of them are flawed, but not all of them are flawed. There's talk of a bunch of people getting involved in politics who were involved previously in the protest movement and judicial reform. There were people involved in that, a lot of them from the high tech community. And we'll see. Maybe someone will actually get involved in politics in the end or not. So, okay, and I'll start taking questions. I see that Paul is the first person to ask questions. He has to come every week because he's the only one who always asks questions, keeps it interesting. So, Paul, go ahead.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for having this question. So, um, my guess, and you can disagree if you want, is that the status quo is pretty much going to stay the same for the foreseeable future. Netanyahu's not going to end the war because he doesn't want to give up power. The Hamas is not going to end because they don't want to give up power. So, what's going to force a change is when is a mandatory next election in Israel. That's my prediction. Okay. Um, at that, if you can disagree or agree, please. If that happens, what happens at the next election? Where can Israel go at that point?
Okay, so let's talk about two parts of what you said. It's certainly a possible scenario going forward, what you just described. Netanyahu clearly doesn't want to end this war for various reasons. Although a lot of people say that the moment we go for elections, he will end the war immediately and get home the hostages and use that as you see, I got home all the hostages if they're still alive at that point. So I don't know, but that's certainly one scenario of what could happen well, once we get to going to elections, because at that point his government can't fall anymore. So that is clearly one scenario. But yes, the scenario of things continuing until that happens is very real. But again, I mean, we are not staying, we're not at the same time. In other words, things are happening. At some point, we are going to start moving on Gaza City slowly but surely. What will happen when we start doing that? Will they kill the hostages? Things will change. Things will be somewhat dynamic. And at some point, Trump may get tired of this. Depends on what the images are, etc. I don't know. I mean, I have very little faith at this point. I was hoping that Trump would have gotten tired of it a while ago. He didn't, and he didn't, tell Netanyahu end this war, period. So he hasn't done that. Bring home the hostages, period. He has not done that. So I'll leave Trump out of this for the moment. But that is still a scenario. The problem is Israel's getting um, more and more isolated in the world, academically, almost completely at this point. You speak to Israeli professors, and they can't get their papers published in any of the journals. Um, they're not being invited to conferences. Conferences that are supposed to be taking place in Israel have moved to Cyprus or other places. Um, it's a real problem in that sense. Business so far seems to be affected a little bit less, but you're starting to hear secondary stories about sales that don't go through, people trying to avoid, um, Israeli companies moving more of their sales to the United States. So you have that. Investments still continue, a little bit less than before, but the opportunity of making too much money is too good here at the moment. So money will always follow where there's an opportunity to make lots of, money doesn't have any uh, political ways in terms of buying products, shall we say. But the isolation of Israel is very real, and the concern of getting more and more isolated. The talk about Israelis losing their visa connect ability to go to Europe without visas, all these sort of things, is things that are, affect one by one a little bit at a time. And again, the next election has to be in the fall of 2026. So we're talking about a month and 3 months away, give or take. It could be a little bit earlier. Now it could happen a little bit. It could happen a little bit earlier. Um, it really depends on a couple of factors. Um, so we'll have to see. The government could fall beforehand. The general sense is it'll have to fall beforehand because the next budget has to be passed by April. And automatically, if the budget is not passed, the government falls. And between the difficulties with the ultra-Orthodox and other issues, it's very hard to see a budget being passed, especially since the budget that would need to be passed is going to be a terrible budget in terms of increase in taxes, all sorts of things that will happen in order to try to keep the deficit within some means of control. So I believe that the latest time for the elections is probably if the budget isn't passed in March, it means there'll be elections in June or July of 2026. That's the most likely time for elections. So, we'll see. I don't know. Um, Look, guys, I think that there's no question in my mind that Netanyahu is one of the worst administrators as as prime minister. He's a terrible administrator. He's a terrible prime minister, but he's a great politician. And so I certainly wouldn't write him off in any election campaign. Lonnie.
Yeah. Hi, Mark. First of all, thank you for these Tel Aviv updates. Um, I came on 15 minutes late, so if you talked about this, I'm sorry if I'm repeating anything. But what is your reaction to the conference at the UN a couple of weeks ago that Israel and the United States did not participate in, which came out with some I thought very positive viewpoints that kind of apropos your point that nobody's, condemning Hamas anywhere. But in that, at that conference, they came out and did, the Arab countries included, did condemn Hamas. They did say that Hamas needed to be disarmed. And they had a plan for, again, the two-state solution. The only thing that I saw in there that sounded that like something Israel would object to was having the Palestinian Authority, be the administrator, but they did say that it had to be reformed first. I mean, I thought that was pretty amazing that the Arab countries came out loudly and clearly condemning Hamas and saying that they had to be disarmed. And
Okay.
I don't hear any, reaction from Israel or anybody about that.
If that had happened 3 years ago, that might have been great. I think the problem people don't understand is in order for there to be any chance of a Palestinian state, the Israeli public has to believe that it could work. It could be that they no longer hate us. I mean, we know they're going to hate us for a long time, but that's the question. And throughout our history of negotiations with the Palestinians, they have never, first of all, they've always stepped back when it came close to some sort of an agreement, whether it was Barak at Camp David or afterwards the Clinton plan or later with Olmert, whichever case it was, they always stepped back and never agreed to what would end this conflict. And, Barak made the famous statement, we have no partner. And he felt he had no partner in Arafat. And maybe we had some sort of partner in Abbas, but he was too afraid to move forward. And at this point, after being burned a number of times, and then after October 7th, it's very hard to see where you get a majority, even a um, even a small majority of Israelis to believe that the solution to our conflict right now is to give the Palestinians a state. I mean, it's very nice to talk about it. I actually believe that the long-term solution to the problem, that is the only solution that exists. But I also don't think it can happen anytime soon. I don't think it can happen anytime soon because A, like I said, the Israeli public is not at all ready for it. And B, because I don't think looking at the Palestinians now would be exactly the time to trust the Palestinians. Look, if I'm a Palestinian at this point, I hate Israelis even more than I hated them before. That's a reality. And so after 75 years of stewing of hatred, they got a turbocharged by what took place over the last 2 years, justified or not justified. So am I willing to um, recognize them as a state and with all that comes with being an independent state? Certainly not. Am I willing to talk about some sort of home rule? Yeah, I'd be willing to talk about some sort of home rule, very limited to begin with, and maybe over a 20-year period, a transition that in 30 years or so might actually be some sort of demilitarized state. If some Palestinian came forth with some sort of plan that was multi-year and understood it would take time, you might be able to sell to the Israeli people. But what you could sell, it's really hard. It's really hard to sell to the Israelis at this point. When the biggest peace activists, some people like Vivian Silvers, living on a kibbutz right by the border, and who spent most of her life working for peace and transporting Gazans to hospitals and doing all those things, was burned to death in her house on October 7th. It's really hard to get Israelis to believe that these are the people who are willing to make peace with us. Now, yes, you make peace with your enemies, you don't make peace with your friends. But there's a level of enemy and there's a level of enemy. And if we start seeing over a period of time that support for Hamas has dropped to 15% of the population, 10% of the population, well, we could talk about things that could transit. But right now, it's not at all clear, but it seems at least 50% of the Palestinians still support Hamas. So really difficult. I applaud what the Arab states did. But how do we translate that into some sort of a peace going forward? I don't know. I'm not optimistic. And, I'm generally was an optimist, and I'm generally willing to take risks for peace because I think we have to take risks. But there's a limit to how much risk one can take at this point. And, I'm not willing to take that greater risk at the moment. And I don't live in Nir Oz or Kfar Aza. I live, 50 miles away. So I don't know. Excuse me, who's Jerry Waxman's statement? Okay. Yes, the Hashmonaim Brigade is designed to increase Haredi involvement. Yes. The idea being, look, the claim was made over the years that the IDF doesn't want the Haredi, that the Haredi will come to the army and they'll come in as Haredi and they'll come out as secular Tel Avivims. And there is a little bit of truth in that, but not because of the army. And that's really the problem. Um, so Um, the problem is that the whole idea of the Haredi world is to build a wall around their world to make sure that their people and their kids have nothing to do with the rest of the society. That what happened in Europe in the 1880s, 18, the Enlightenment when it came, Haskalah, which resulted in 50% of the Haredi communities of Europe leaving and going to the United States and a small percentage to Israel and becoming secular. They've come out with a system to try to block that by keeping their people separated from the rest of society as best as they can. The army the fear of them is that the army is a place where they will come into contact with the rest of the world. So there have been certain methods to bring as Haredim to be aircraft mechanics, to be working in intelligence, all sorts of places which are not combat soldiers, which is what we need the most. But the problem with those jobs is, if you're a mechanic on an Air Force base, even if you live separately and everything else, they're going to be secular people you're going to come into contact with. Your pilot might be a secular guy, who knows who, et cetera, et cetera. So they don't want it. So the idea of the Hashmonaim Brigade is to have a brigade that is only made up of ultra-Orthodox people. The commanders are all ultra-Orthodox, and therefore they won't have that problem. So, um, so that's what the point is. The hope is that the numbers will grow. Right now, the numbers, but there are 35 in this first group of Hashmonaim Brigade. That's not a real number. Just keep in mind that Israel has lost 10,000 combat troops in this war, between deaths and wounded, 10,000. And so, and our needs are greater than they ever were before. Okay, Denise wanted to speak and can't raise her hand. So Denise,
Hi. Hi, Mark.
hi.
Um, I, along with everybody else, really appreciate that you do this. It's a great way to get some perspective. I just wanted to make a couple comments. I feel like myself, and if I'm feeling it, I'm assuming lots of other people feel this, is this flip-flop of perspective that for a long time, you're proud of being Jewish, you're proud of Israel. You may not want to live there, but you think it's a cool, interesting place, and you hold them in high regard. The army, you're proud of so many things. And I feel like over the last 9 months, I've slowly flip-flopped. I've swayed. And if I feel this, and I tend to be pretty open-minded and I try to think about all perspectives, that I'm really sad because I feel like all Jews now, all over the world, are in danger. I feel like Israel, and I've heard you talk about this in your podcast, is creating their own demise. I think a little bit from Ezra Klein's perspective with that guy he interviewed, that they said, and who knows where they get their statistics, that 70% of Israelis feel like the Palestinians are sort of non-human, right? Like that feeling that, like when you label someone or start to feel about someone as non-human, as the Americans treated our slaves and all that stuff. Once you fall into that category, how can the world respect you if that's who your people are? That Israel, and I actually say we because I'm Jewish, even though I'm not Israeli, I sort of feel like we have destroyed X percent of the Gaza Strip. I feel like the West Bank and the settlements, and I don't know how far back the start of that was, but that was the beginning of the demise. And whenever you occupy, the occupiers and the occupied are not free. And it kind of brings me back to Passover. Like, I don't think I can ever say at the end of Passover, next year in Jerusalem. Like, that is not how I feel at all anymore. I have a wedding to go to in October, and I think I'm not going in Tel Aviv. I have religious family there and non-religious. It's a non-religious wedding, and I would love to be there, but I feel like I can't stomach it. I feel like what's coming down the pike now is it's not here yet, but I think there's going to be major boycotts of Israel academically and throughout all different kinds of industrial sectors. So that whole divest thing is real, and it's coming. I think it's going to come hard.
Okay, there's no question. Yeah, I don't want to cut you off, but I'll cut you off a little bit because I mean, your point is well taken. First of all, come anyway to the wedding because in Tel Aviv you don't feel the rest of the country. Just stay in Tel Aviv and don't leave Tel Aviv. Um, that's my plan usually. I don't go anywhere but Ben Gurion Airport. So You could come to Tel Aviv. It's a whole different world. But okay, look, all your points are true, and the fact of the matter is, um, it all began in the Six-Day War, to be honest with you, when we occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And there are people who, and because at that point it was Sinai and Golan. Golan's never really been a problem because it's pretty empty, and Sinai was empty at the time. But that's a whole other story. But occupying is bad, right? I don't care however you define it. And I felt it way back when in the early 80s when I did reserve duty in Gaza, or actually even in the 70s when I was a regular soldier in the West Bank for a short period of time. Occupying is bad. And the only way you can justify occupation over a long period of time is to think that in some which way, this psychologically, I don't mean in an active sort of way, but psychologically, you're superior to those people you're occupying. That's the reality. Now, do all Israel, I don't think 70% of the Israelis believe that the Palestinians aren't people. I mean, peoplehood maybe, but not individuals. They don't think of them as people. I don't think that 70% of Israelis wish, they were all dead. They might wish they had all moved to, I don't know, to somewhere else. But no, I don't think 70% of them wish they were all dead or gone or whatever in that sense. But yes, but it's a real problem. But the problem is, go back before the war, right? Before this war, um, I was already depressed by the fact that I didn't think we could get to a peace agreement with the Palestinians in my lifetime. And again, I'm hoping I'll live at least another 20 years. But even in that period of time, I did not think before the war that we would reach an agreement with the Palestinians because of the chasm that exists between us. Leaving aside those people on our side who want to settle all of the West Bank because God gave it to us, and I'm a big opponent of anybody from any religion that thinks God has told him to do something, whether he's Muslim, Christian, or Jew. Anyone who thinks God has told him to do something is a very dangerous person. Because how do you argue with someone who thinks God has told you to do something? So on the Jewish side, those who want to hold on to every last inch of the West Bank because God gave it to us, very dangerous. But same problem on the West, on the Muslim side. This conflict has become partly a religious fight. And the Muslims, as Hamas is a Muslim religious fanatical group, believe that no part of the Middle East that was once part of Islam should be held by anyone but Islam, Dar al-Islam. And so we have a real clash here. Now, we're the stronger party still, and as long as we're the stronger party, we'll still exist. As much as some of Golda's statements were cheesy or whatever, but her statement that said that if the Arabs, well, there's still states, forget about the terrorist groups, if the Arab armies put down their arms tomorrow, there'll be peace. If Israel put down its arms tomorrow, we'd be destroyed. It's still true. It's still true. If the Gazans put down their arms tomorrow and say they have no interest in destroying Israel, of conquering Israel, being and willing to live in peace with Israel, there'll be peace with Gaza. All Israelis will be. West Bank is a more problematic issue, but Gaza, there'll be peace with Gaza almost instantly. If Israel says, "Well, we'll put down our arms and do whatever you want," we'll all be killed. So nothing is simple. Nothing is black and white. For all our faults, and we have them, and you know from reading what I write that I think we have lots of faults. But despite all our faults, the fact is we live in a very dangerous neighborhood, and it's not all our fault. That's all I can say. It's not all our fault. It's two sides to this, and both sides, and the Palestinians have agency over the fact that we're still at war with them. They could have settled this multiple times, and they decided not to. All the way back to 1936, we might have saved half of the Holocaust, people who were killed in the Holocaust. If in 1936 they would have accepted the Peel Plan. So they've never accepted any deal that related to dividing the land between them and us. The people who claim we're a colonist or whatever will say, well, they had no reason to. We had no right. You can go into whether they had a right or not right, but the fact of the matter is, if they had once made a compromise, once in the last 100 years, there would have been peace. But they've never been willing to make a compromise. So please come to Tel Aviv anyway. I'll even buy you a cup of coffee. But the fact of the matter is, we make mistakes and we have some terrible people. There's some terrible leaders, but we also have some really great people who are really working hard to try to change it and who believe in making the change. And we have, I was talking to a woman a little while ago in the coffee shop I usually go to, and we were talking about how terrible the situation is, etc. And we talked a little about and she said, and I said, I hope there will be people left in this country. And she said, well, I hope the youth will stay. So, well, the youth actually believes they can still change the country. So they're still young and they still don't know that it's really difficult to make change, but they still believe they can make a change. And there are a lot of people dedicated to making that change. Will it happen? I don't know, but I have not given up hope that it can happen, that it will happen, because without hope, um, we can't give up any hope. And I understand sitting um, in the diaspora, identifying as a Jew is very problematic these days. I understand that very well. And identifying with the Israeli government can be incredibly problematic. But the Israeli government does not represent the majority of Jews in this country. Majority of people in this country, over 70 to 80%, were willing to give a ceasefire to get back the hostages and end the war now and deal with Hamas later. Again, that doesn't mean they love the Palestinians. And most of us are very worried, worried that the Palestinians, if they had the opportunity, would kill us. That's a reality. We have to make sure that they don't. And hope for the best. Barbara.
I just have a comment for Denise. Denise, you have to remember or compare it to the US. Trump is doing some horrible things. Does that mean everyone in the US supports all the things he's doing? No. And it's the same thing in Israel. Netanyahu, I think he's destroying Israel, but he's doing some terrible things also. But the people do not support him. If you remember the huge demonstrations against judicial reform, and now the demonstrations to get the hostages released. So it don't be fooled by what you read in the press, which is that all Israelis are bad, that this is just Netanyahu and this is just Trump here.
And there are small area of supporters, some extremists among them. But yes,
Right, right.
that's very
Yes.
true. Okay. I think we're going to end on this positive, semi-positive note. I want to thank you all. I think, like I said, the podcast with Jonathan from who I interviewed about foreign aid worldwide should be interesting. There are a few other interesting guests that I'll be interviewing this week, and they'll be on this week and next week in some of the podcasts I'll be releasing. And let's hope for the best. I'm afraid I can already assume that we'll meet again in 2 weeks. Hopefully there'll be some good news, or I don't know what areas we could have good. Did it rain lately? No, it hasn't rained, and I don't expect rain for at least another month. But I have to say, the only good news in this country, and the only good things I think I wrote about it, the only thing that planning has been really good about has been water planning. We built enough desalination plants that take care of all of our domestic water needs, drinking, sewage, and everything else. And the fact that we recycle almost all our sewage means that our agriculture has enough water as well. So while most of the Middle East is parched, it doesn't affect us at all. One of the few times when our long-term planning has actually worked, we've always done well in terms of water planning. So let's hope for rain, just because if you wanted to come and visit, the Galilee is very low on water. Those waterfalls are drying up, but hopefully there'll be it'll be a rainy winter, but you never know. It's been a hot summer. So, okay. Well, thank you all, and I'll see you all again in 2 weeks. Please keep on listening to the podcasts, leave some positive reviews, and see you in 2 weeks. Thank you all.